everyone, and welcome to podcast number 6. Today, we are going to be talking about consciousness, spirit, and the soul. So, we have Jan with us today. So, how are you today, Jan?
Great. This is one of my favorite subjects. So, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I think we're going to be building off a tweet from Elon Musk, my one of my personal heroes. And I think it's going to be something that will take the audience on a little rabbit hole into exploring something that I think is profoundly important and also very relevant in today's age.
All right, so let's get started with the tweet that you just mentioned. So the tweet is from Jack Dorsey, and he is talking about the takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk. And he says that Elon is a singular solution he trusts. So to quote him, he says, "I trust his mission to extend the light of consciousness." So what I want to ask you, Jan, is what consciousness has to do with this tweet or with today's reality?
It's a great question, and it's almost an infinite question. The search to answer this tricky statement of what is consciousness is unanswered to this day. We don't actually have an answer to this question, and I'm not going to simply propose an answer so straightforward, because that would be a little bit presumptuous. But that being said, let's break down what I think is important. There is that there is a sense of consciousness. We are here now. There is an awakeness, right? And I think what stands out to me about this phrase, the light of consciousness, is to realize that there doesn't have to be consciousness, right? When we know that when someone or something dies, there is something missing. Now, I can't tell you the exact details of what the difference is between what's missing and what is there, but what we can recognize that there is a difference. And I think Musk is passionate about extending the light of consciousness of humanity through, for example, Mars with SpaceX, and also here on Earth with the efforts of Tesla. Now, that being said, why might he be interested in Twitter? Well, for me, Twitter is in a way the foundational architecture of a global consciousness, like literally the infrastructure of it. You know, if you have consciousness in your brain, for example, or in our being, better said, the brain and the neural pathways carry consciousness in some way, right? And so what is the equivalent in an infrastructure sense for the planet? And I think that would be, that's what I think Musk thinks Twitter is. And so building a global conversation like Twitter does is a very unique thing to do. And so by protecting that asset, that scarce asset, there aren't many Twitters, right? There's one Twitter really, is a good way to kind of make sure that humanity has the right tools in place to take on the challenges of this 21st century. Because I think a good way to think about consciousness is, this is not a fully correct way, but it's a simplified way and can work, is it's about computation. So if you think about this box here as being a problem, right? Let's think about climate change, for example, right? Or how can my business make more money, right? Either way, it's a problem, right? And the size of the box describes the scale of the problem. In order to solve the problem, you must assemble a state of consciousness that is either equivalent to or greater than the box. If you cannot do this, you cannot solve the problem. So problem solving can be understood as assembling computational capabilities, assembling enough consciousness to solve a problem. So if we are going to have a chance at solving climate change, if we're going to have a chance to solve the big challenges that we face, and small, we need a way of assembling enough consciousness. And so Twitter is potentially a specific mechanism for assembling a global consciousness, not in an abstract sense of there's a global consciousness, but it's literally here on this digital platform and people are participating in it. And so I think safeguarding a place to have those kind of conversations is important because of what it will allow, not just for the rest of the century, well, let's say the next few decades in the century, but what might come from there.
Sorry. Okay, so when you're talking about consciousness in a box, right? How would you define consciousness? Is that a piece of data? Is that the presence of a person? How would you really define the word consciousness here?
Right. Well, you're getting me to do what I didn't want to do, which is try and define it. But of course, you're very persuasive, so I'll give it my best shot. Well, I've always seen my purpose here on Earth as to try and elevate human consciousness at scale. So I've tried to think about consciousness from that perspective. And where I have arrived at is not that simply that consciousness is computation. I think that consciousness is connecting. So in real time, it's the connecting that connects. And so what's tricky is we end up with a language that becomes almost tautological, very simple, very straightforward, connecting that connects. What does that actually mean? But if you look at my body, for example, right, there is a formness to it. There's something that's holding it together. And not just sort of in a theoretical sense, it's literally right now, right? And this consciousness, if I was to get shot, for example, or crushed, or something would happen to me, those connections would no longer be there. And if there's sufficient damage done, then my consciousness will disappear, at least in the sense of this yan here. So I think of consciousness as a connecting. It's in real time. It's active. It's not connections. It's not to connect. It's the connecting phenomena itself, that there is a connecting. Another way, could be to explore this idea of a universal consciousness, and that there's consciousness really in everything. And certainly from a philosophical perspective, that's very possible. And also from a scientific perspective, that's possible too. So, is a photon an expression of consciousness? Is a graviton or gravitational wave an expression of consciousness? To me, yes, it is. It's a form of connecting things together. So for me, when I see things that are connecting, that's evidence of consciousness. And that also takes us towards an organization, right? An organization, it's very important to note, does not exist there's no physicalism to an organization, right? Yes, you can have your office building, and maybe, if you make like a mouse or, hardware, tangible things, but that in and of itself is not the organization, right? The organization exists in our minds. And this is a really important point. So organizations have a sense of consciousness too, a we-ness, right? So we are Leadapreneur, right, for example. And so we have a certain state of consciousness, and the state of consciousness of our Leadapreneur team, or indeed any team of any organization, is about the connecting that is happening in that moment. And so that, of course, is affected by the past. What have we done in the past? And also what we might expect the future to be. But the specific place, I think, to find consciousness is in the here and now. So I think consciousness is a lot about communicating, and it's a lot to do with the flow of information. And actually what I think consciousness does is, I have a habit of inventing terms, because I find that you need to create new terms to allow new possibilities. So I create this term for myself called MEMI, M-E-M-I, kind of building off the gene meme idea there. But what it relates to is the idea that there are three foundational building blocks of the universe: mass, energy, and information. Or let's put it in the correct order there: energy, mass, information, EMI. Right? Anything qua thing, anything as a thing, exists as a structure of energy, mass, and information. Now, the reason why I call it MEMI with the M at the beginning is it's about meaningful energy, mass, information. What is meaningful to me is not what's meaningful to you, which is not meaningful to the ant, which is not meaningful to the neutrino that's passing through me, which is not meaningful to Jupiter, right? So what is the relevant energy, mass, information structure? Well, that's, I think, what consciousness decides. I think consciousness collapses possibility into tangible probabilities, and it does that through this interaction with MEMI. So we're kind of connecting things together. So the organization, to kind of bring it back to a more tangible reality, is bringing together energy, mass, and information, right? So money, trust, products are all being mixed up in a consciousness to be able to achieve something. So there's also that sense of an idea of perhaps that purpose is important to consciousness, a teleological sense that there is a goal, that this is going somewhere to some end. And so that might be, a good way to differentiate there as something. Does a rock have consciousness? That's a big question. But in one sense, it doesn't seem to have a purpose, right? As opposed to, for example, a human going to make themselves dinner, right? They're making themselves dinner because they're hungry. So there's an intentionality to it. And so I think all of this loops back into ultimately recognizing that I think it is, from my perspective, important to recognize that the core constraint about the capability of anything is its consciousness. So the big phrase, the big sentence would be: the capability of a complex system is constrained by its consciousness. Or you could say more simply, consciousness controls capability. It's not money. It's not knowledge. It's the consciousness and the awareness of that consciousness. And so to improve capability requires an improvement in the state of consciousness of the individual, of the organism, of the organization. And so this is particularly relevant to deal with the complex chaos of Industry 4.0, that you cannot match the challenge of growing complexity, exponentially growing complexity, with more money. It won't work, because it's not money that solves a problem, it's consciousness that solves a problem. So one of the key challenges, I think, in the transition into Industry 4.0 is the realization that we're talking about upgrading states of consciousness so that organizations can deal with the challenges that they're facing. You know, and that creates some interesting questions about where does that all end up, and that might well be the conscious corporation, but that's maybe that's something that will pop up later in our conversation here.
So Jan, Leadapreneur being your organization, you really emphasize on consciousness a lot, right? Why do you keep introducing consciousness in your programs?
Great question. And I think that leads me back to this difference where I would differentiate between competence and capability. And of course, it's important to have competence, right? You're able to perform a task, but that doesn't mean that you have, for me, the difference between competence and capability is that capability is contextual. It's in the here and now, right? So it's, for example, you might be competent at shooting a basketball hoop, right? You can throw the ball and it goes into the hoop, but do you have the capability to throw the game-winning shot in the final in the last second of the game? That's a very different kind of a capability, I would say. I don't think that's a competence, it's a capability. And so what I think differentiates competence and capability is consciousness. It's about consciousness. It provides a universal language for addressing what you need to focus on in order to succeed and have the right capability, to have the capability you need to achieve the goals that you want in the context that you are in. And I think this is one of the key challenges around traditional training programs, is they focus too much on competency development. But you might have someone, for example, I'll put it in a bit more dramatic way. Someone who's a very competent shooter, right? You take them to a shooting range and they shoot their gun and they become very good at practicing, and they're competent at hitting the target with their rifle. This does not in any way at all mean that that person is going to be an effective soldier, right? If they have to go to war and they have to have a different kind of capability. And so what you can see there is that bringing in things like mindset, and combining with skill set and awareness of your contextual reality, these things can be unified more simply under the language of consciousness. And so I specifically use that term because I think it allows a much more effective way of improving one's capability. I think it's a distraction to focus too much on competency development without, for example, developing an equivalent mindset, right? Does that person have the will to win? Have they got the spirit that is required to overcome the challenges that they will face on the journey that they embark on? And so, on the one hand, consciousness can seem like this woo-woo language, but for me, there's very much a physics of consciousness. And information theory provides a very clear description of consciousness. Complexity theory provides, useful models for thinking about consciousness, as do things like system dynamics. And I'm sharing these terms to kind of emphasize the fact that they're certainly in the scientific world, that there's been great leap forward in understanding these kind of phenomena. And actually, ultimately, I think that we really stand at the brink of a whole new age. I think what we will be able to achieve with consciousness in this century will be remarkable. And one of the things I'm passionate about is, you mentioned Musk earlier, Musk is sort of mobilizing a great amount of MEMI resources to go to Mars, right? And I think that's fantastic, go for it. But what would be the equivalent of going inside, right? What would be an equivalent? Let's say it's going to cost $1 trillion to go to Mars, right? I'm just going to put that number out there. Let's say it's $1 trillion. What would we achieve if we spent $1 trillion going into our states of consciousness and really putting in, the equivalent level of talent, money, engineering that we put into space exploration, into inner space exploration? And I think we will find astonishing things. And we can see, just glimpses of this, for example, through the powers of meditation, and I think potentially prayer, right? And things like that, where we are working with our inner states, right? Even some things like psychology, psychotherapy, right? These are all working with our inner worlds. But I think what's missing there is just mobilizing MEMI, basically, just is putting at mega scales. And that's, I think, going to be one of the things that will really differentiate our century. And I think that's why I position Leadapreneur in that way. I think it's going to be one of the great mega trends. I think digitalization is only just starting to unlock the conversation about consciousness, really. And where we will go in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades will be towards a necessary understanding of consciousness, because looping back to what I said at the beginning, it is consciousness that controls capability. And in order to upgrade capability to deal with Industry 4.0's avocat reality, you must have a more elevated state of consciousness.
When you talk a little bit about, you mentioned spirit, right? You mentioned about consciousness improves capability, because within consciousness you're talking about will and you're talking about spirit. So what more can you share on us in terms of spirit? So from an organization perspective, how can I create the spirit, or embed the spirit in my people to get them to raise to that level of consciousness that can in turn increase the capability?
Yep, that's a great question. So I think a useful way that I find to think about spirit is the vital energy within us, what we're expressing, right? The living life force within us. Now, maybe some people who are particularly diehard on the scientific method might say, but there's no scientific proof for spirit and the soul and all these things. And I think that's a bit misguided, because clearly there's a very significant difference between my alive grandma and my dead grandma. My grandma passed away recently, and say whatever you will, there's just probably the most extreme difference that we can find in reality today. So there is something that's missing. And I'm referring to that missing thing in part as spirit. There's more to it, I think, than spirit, but let's just keep it simple for now. So I think one is to encourage the expression of spirit. And one of the things that happens in the management bureaucracy is it crushes spirit. You're not allowed to be spirited in a management bureaucracy because it's too inconvenient. It causes too much disruption. Spirited individuals will have too much independent thinking. They will go and do their own things when they're meant to be just following the SOP and following the command and control structures. So I think it's about being able to have the courage at a very foundational level to reorientate one's culture from a management culture perspective to one that embraces a conversation around spirit, and to recognize that it matters. And this is why in Leadapreneur, what I've essentially done is pre-package certain types of spirit. There's many different flavors of spirit, right? Just as there's many different flavors of food in the world, right? And so we have, for example, the agile warrior, right? So the agile warrior, her spirit is to be fierce and to go forward and to fight for the better world. She has the spirit of leaping into battle, right? And so she's basically kicking ass and fighting hard for what she believes in, right? So that, if we put the agile warrior as a box, and we're going to put a certain kind of spirit in that box, then we might have the spirit of the pathfinder. It's a very different kind of spirit, because this person is not so much combative as it is enabling, right? They are enabling their cohort to find the way forward, empowering their warriors together. And so the different roles that we have at Leadapreneur, with its warriors, pathfinders, explorers, and so on and so forth, are really about being able to in a way standardize spirit. And I think that then becomes a challenge at the organizational level. How do you standardize spirit while still maintaining individuality, right? And I think that's one of the things that we are figuring out at Leadapreneur, is that we can create 100 different warriors, and there'll all be 100 unique individuals, but they will share a common sense of spirit, right? The way in which they go about things, of course, if they've done things according to the Leadapreneur approach, right? So I think that's a really important point to make, is that one is about legitimizing the conversation around spirit in the organization. And then step two is figuring out how do we actually go beyond just having a chat about it, but actually integrating it into our way of working and recognizing that we need different types of spirit working together in different ways to be able to achieve certain kinds of outcomes. So in Leadapreneur, for example, we have the spirit of the warrior. She's fighting to implement her project. We have the spirit of the pathfinder. He is guiding the warriors to help them achieve their goals, like a coaching role, basically. But it's not a coach. And I think that's important to recognize. A pathfinder is not simply a coach. You have to have a coach with a certain kind of spirit, right? Because a pathfinder is not going to have the same kind of energy as someone who's just a coach. And also what you need to do is you need to standardize that, because if you have 50 coaches in your organizations and they all have completely different spirits, there's going to be a lot of variance there, and it's going to be very tricky to create an effective culture there. Whereas if you have 50 pathfinders who are standardized around the common sense of what that spirit means, there's still room for individuality and expression. Yet at the same time, there is a certain standardization, and that means that the ability to work together is still effective. So you're getting the best of both worlds. And then, of course, you have the strategos, which is a different spirit entirely as well, much more about aligned around strategy and leading larger groups of people towards achieving strategic objectives.
Okay, yeah. So what I'm understanding from this is, if I have the sort of spirit, Leadapreneur has warrior, and we have pathfinder. So those kind of spirit can drive projects, can drive outcome more. But if in my organization I don't have a warrior, I don't have a pathfinder, I don't have a leaderpreneur, basically, how can I begin to create consciousness in my organization? And also, what I want to add on top of this question is Industry 4.0 reality, because there's just so many things out there, right? For example, in an organization, we want to have some people focusing on AI, some on blockchain, some on digitizing certain things. So there's just so many things. So how do we bring consciousness into all of it, and with it the spirit of building a better world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously going to be cheeky here and say you should probably hire us, because we spend some, we're quite good at this now, so we can help you with that. But of course, where to start, right? I think that it comes back down to that idea of it's about a conversation, right? About discussing these things. You have to. It's difficult to suddenly go from nothing to 100%, right? It's not like that. It's about creating the conversation that allows the organization to start become more aware, start to see that this is actually important, right? Because it's scary, it's difficult. A lot of people will have a lot of beliefs and biases around what it means to talk about consciousness, right? So I think it's important to start inviting people for a conversation. And the way in which to make that very practical and tangible is, I think that what we have developed at Leadapreneur is a way of essentially what I think is about measuring consciousness. And that is about what you care about. And so to become more conscious is to ask yourself, where am I spending my time? Where am I in terms of hours? Where am I spending my money? And where am I spending my effort? And effort is about repetitions. How many times am I repeatedly doing this? And so you can understand the state of consciousness of any an individual or an organization pretty well by getting data on those three things. Where are we spending our time? Actual time, not where we want to spend our time, right? It's a bit like, okay, if I want to be fit, right? I want to have a state of consciousness around where I'm living a healthy lifestyle. Where am I spending my time? Am I in the pub or am I in the gym, right? And it's not what I wish to do, it's where I am actually being. And that's difficult, because sometimes you have to cut through a lot of bullshit to actually figure out what is it you're actually doing, right? Where are you spending the time? Then it's about, where is the money really going, right? Follow the money is a favorite line in many movies, but follow the money. Where are you putting your money? And finally, what are you things that you're repeating? For example, a lot of organizations will do a one-off innovation program / event, and that's good, it has value, but is it sustained? Are you repeating this? And what is the number on that repetition? Is it once a year? Is it once a month? Is it once a week? And so by starting to build a conversation around asking yourselves, what do we care about as a team, as a department, as an organization, in terms of where we're spending our time, money, and effort, that will already be a good way to start your conversation and to embrace the bigger language of consciousness. Because I also don't want to make it this thing where consciousness is this very big, heavy thing where you need a PhD to talk about it and all those kinds of things. No, it's a very straightforward conversation. It's just about a certain kind of conversation with a certain level of honesty in it. Then another thing you can do is explore behaviors and what do we value. And so for me, I kind of breaking down that CARES, using that more as an acronym, I break it down to some criteria that also draw on complexity leadership. So for example, the C draws on creativity. So are we expressing our creativity? The R is about resilience. Are we, let's go with the correct order. CA, A is about adaptability. Are we adapting to the challenges and changes that we see? So what we're seeing here is good evidence of high consciousness as we're seeing creativity. We're seeing evidence of adaptability, right? We're also, today we were talking about resilience. Resilience is the ability to take a hit, get back up again, and be back to 100% performance. So it's a bit like if you're in a boxing match, you get punched in the face, you get knocked on the floor. It's okay, it happens sometimes, right? It's not great, but it's about dealing with it really. And so what you're doing there is you need to get back up on your feet, and not just get back up again, but back in 100% back in the fight, right? So resilience really is a good example of where there is a mature consciousness, which can understand that sometimes there's traumatic events in life, things go wrong, it doesn't always work out. Immature consciousness encounters obstacles and adversities and hits and just shatters and breaks and just can't handle it. The E is about excellence. Consciousness tends to pursue something. So to what standard are you pursuing that, right? So when you see a beautiful piece of art, right, that's a great evidence of a high state of consciousness. When contradistinction, if you go to a part of the city that's full of trash, it's ugly, the windows are smashed, all that is essentially evidence of a low consciousness environment, right? Because there's no light of consciousness being shone into that environment. And then finally, the S is about sustainability. So resilience is essentially about, in the short term, in the boxing match, right? You get hit, you get back up again. So it's about being what Nicholas Taleb, who wrote Black Swan, called anti-fragile, though I prefer the term resilience. And then S is about long-term sustainability. So consciousness can sustain itself from today till tomorrow and thereafter. And so a good example, and so these kind of 5 terms are good ways to kind of have an indication of the level of consciousness in an organization. How creative are we? How adaptable? What's our levels of resilience? Are we pursuing excellence? And are we sustaining our endeavors?
Okay, so to wrap it up, we have talked about consciousness, which is basically connecting that connects, if I'm saying it right, or it's basically the connecting phenomena, being in the here and the now. And then we've talked about how Leadapreneur is bringing consciousness in the program that we offer to our clients, because we focus in the race, or not in the race, but between competency and capability, we focus more on capability. If you increase in consciousness, you increase capability in your organization. But if you don't have what Leadapreneur has, which is the spirit that we bring in our program, the warrior, the pathfinder, the explorer, and all of that, you can still go ahead and create that consciousness in your organization by seeing where you're spending your time, your money, your effort, or by following the acronym that Jan shared, which is creativity, adaptability, resilience, excellence, and sustainability. So thank you so much again for your time, and I hope that our viewers were able to learn a lot about consciousness. I mean, for me, for me that was really enlightening, because I keep hearing it, but you don't really know what it is. I mean, connecting that connects. I'm still a bit. I'm like, okay, what is it really? But okay, that was fun, Jan. So do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, which is Tina has just joined me here. My little meow meow. Oh, baby, want to say hi? No. Right? And there's many different forms of consciousness. And I think, part of, I'm passionate about this idea of everyday enlightenment. I don't think it's zero or total enlightenment. I think there's an infinite journey, really. And I think that a good way to kind of characterize a growing enlightenment in oneself is to have compassion to different kinds of consciousness, and to expand one's heart and one's mind to recognizing that. So, for example, recognizing that Tina here has her own state of consciousness, right? And it's important to be able to, when you look at other humans in particular, to realize that they are also a state of consciousness, right? And that we're all here in this now. And so that really is very humbling. When you really reflect on that and you really come down to that, it's an amazing thing to go into. And what I think is particularly exciting is the opportunity to take that kind of wisdom and fuse it into our organizations, because I think that's going to create much better organizations and help us build a much better world.
On the note of us building a better world, I wish you all goodbye and see you all next week. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Leadapreneurs YouTube channel to get your weekly updates.